Joining us tonight for the first time. You do have question cards on your table, which we encourage you to fill out. However, I will preface that by saying that I take questions from the audience with the microphone first before those. So we do have two volunteers who are going to come to the front. So just wave your hand to either get the microphone, or perfect, or hand us the cards. Just while they're coming up, I'll start with the first question. So there is a recurring issue of freedom of speech versus religious deference. Danish cartoons, recent video that sparked protests resulting in the death of the U.S. ambassador in Libya. How do you see the clash between Western and Eastern culture ever being resolved when there are some issues that are unresolvable, such as the rights of women?
I'm not sure I would accept the premise that there are issues that are unresolvable. They may be difficult to resolve, but with determination and time, one should be able to resolve them. But let me go back to your first question. I think we are seeing a situation where a small minority of Muslims often take the law into their own hands and use violence to impose their will. What worries me about this is often we don't hear from the religious leaders or the political leaders in the country. They must get these extremists to know that they don't speak for Islam, they don't represent their religion, and that the majority do not accept their behavior. Because if you don't do that, it's almost like encouraging impunity. It will be repeated tomorrow and in other parts. I think on the question of not agreeing to certain things, when you look at the Quran, Islamic doctrine, and also Christianity, and all religions for that matter, I think there's much more that unites us than divides us. And we should focus on those areas that unite us. I mean, every religion, for me, is education in social morality. It's wrong to kill, it's wrong to steal, it's wrong to lie. They all have it. And the question is getting the people to apply the truth. I often say that if there is a problem, the problem is not the faith. It's often the faithful and the way some of us behave. They would tell you Islam is merciful, it speaks of peace. But why do they not condemn the extremists? And so sometimes politicians exploit it, and they should be condemned if they do.
Thank you. We'll just get the microphone here, okay? And then go to the front.
Your successor was recently criticized for his trip to Tehran to attend the non-aligned movement meetings, particularly given the pressure of the global community to try to keep a lid on the Iranians. Canada obviously took a very different stance in closing its embassy in Iran. And I wonder if you could comment both. If you were still in the seat, would you have gone to the non-aligned movement? And how do you feel about the withdrawal of diplomatic contacts?
Yeah. Yes, I would have gone. And I went to Iran several times. In fact, you don't have to be friendly with the people to talk to them. You don't have to, when you're talking of peace and harmony, you don't have to talk to your friends to make peace. You talk to the other side. And this is why, for example, as envoy, I went to Iran twice. I went to Moscow, I went to China, I went to other places, even though people are saying they have vetoed resolutions. If you don't talk to them, how do you influence them? Is a question nobody has been able to answer for me. You may want to use force, but force is not an answer to everything. We saw what has happened with the use of force in Iraq. We saw what happened between Israel and Hezbollah, the most powerful army in the region, could not tame Hezbollah. At the end of the war, when we worked out the cessation of hostilities, Hezbollah was still shooting Katyushas into Israel after 3 weeks of bombardment, which for Hezbollah, survival was victory. For Israel, much more was at stake, as I indicate in the book. For the most powerful army in the region not to be able to contain or defeat Hezbollah in an asymmetrical war, which is extremely difficult, the myth is gone. So why do you get into this? And I think if I were a Canadian Prime Minister or Foreign Minister, I wouldn't have withdrawn the embassy, the diplomats from Iran. It is when these things are going on and you have tensions, when you need eyes and ears on the ground, when you need to understand what is happening, when you need to follow developments. And so I personally do not go for those kinds of moves. It's dramatic, but you need to dialogue.
So Frank and then Wayne.
I've been waiting to ask you this for a very long time. Now that you're no longer Secretary General, and maybe you're able to speak freely on this topic, many would argue that the UN Charter, which gives the Security Council a lot of power and individual veto rights, really is not equipped to handle the major issues that face the world today because of the veto power. You were Secretary General. How do you really feel about that? And is the UN actually effective?
Yeah. I think there's no doubt that the UN has to be reformed. And no UN reform will be complete without the reform of the Security Council. The Security Council, as constituted today, reflects the geopolitical realities of 1945. The world has changed, and the UN must change and adapt. As Secretary General, I tried very hard to reform the Security Council, put concrete proposals on the table, trying to make the Council more representative and more democratic. And if we had been able to reform the Council, it would have become even more legitimate. You have a Council today that has no member from a country like India, which has 1/5 of the world's population. You have a Council today that doesn't have a single permanent member from Latin America, and not a single one from Africa, with 53 countries. Japan, which is the second highest contributor, is not in the Council. And in addition to that, we are seeing the emergence of these new nations, from Brazil to India, South Africa, Indonesia. These countries would want a seat at the table. In terms of economics, they are beginning to have weight, and there's a shift towards Asia. But with that economic prosperity comes demand for political recognition. And I personally believe that the UN Security Council has to be reformed, because as it stands now, people believe that the power base of the UN is so narrowly based on 5 members, and the veto can't stop action. The only interesting thing is that veto is a negative power. You can block, but you cannot use veto to make things happen. Iraq was a very good example, where the Council did not go ahead, and the US went in on its own. And so I see reform as essential, and it has to come. It has to come if, over time, we expect the emerging big powers nations to cooperate. Otherwise, some may just ignore the decision, the Council and its decisions. But of course, having said that, I need to add that from my experience, there are 2 issues that, let's say, 2 things, when granted, it's extremely difficult to take back. One is subsidies, and the other is privileges. We hear a lot about subsidies because the privileges are often with the powerful, and you don't hear enough about them. But in both situations, it's extremely difficult to take back, and we have that situation in the council. Besides, you cannot reform the council and take the veto power back without the approval of the 5 permanent members. They got it. They protected themselves in the charter.
You got Wayne. And just put your hand up for the next microphone.
Mr. Annan, I think during dinner I gave you a heads up that I might ask you a personal question tonight. You've worked with some of the world's most important leaders, met them all, maybe a few rock stars. Huh? What I would like to know from you tonight is, of all the people you've met and worked with during your career, is there somebody that's impressed you the most? And more importantly, is there someone that's maybe the worst badass you met?
I think in today's world and the past 2 decades, most of us, if you ask me, I would say it will be Mandela. Nelson Mandela has been quite remarkable in that, in his whole being, his capacity to forgive, his incredible resilience. 27 years in prison, and he comes out without bitterness. And I've seen him with his citizens of South Africa, white, Indian, black, no difference. And it's quite a remarkable thing, because one would expect that from that background, that experience, someone who would be bitter, who would be seeking revenge. None of that. On the other side, what is quite interesting is when we think of these dictators and wicked people, we sometimes expect them to have horns and be quite different. Remarkably, they are like you and me, and sometimes very calm, very quiet. They pray, even they would excuse themselves to go and pray. I was discussing with Saddam Hussein in February 98, when the US was thinking of bombing Iraq because he wouldn't open his palaces for the inspectors to check whether he has weapons or not. In the middle of it, he said, "Excuse me, I have to go and pray." And I said to myself, well, if he's going to pray, then he probably, there's probably a chance. There's probably somewhere I could reach him. And when he came back, actually when he left, I asked the interpreter who knows him best, am I getting through to him? He said, yes, yes, yes. I mean, he had to be careful. But the same people who can be as brutal as they are, take extreme measures to protect themselves. For example, I told Saddam Hussein, you don't have to push every issue to the crisis point. You don't have to push every problem to the crisis point for US to want to bomb or international community to want to impose sanctions. If there are problems brewing, please use that phone and call me. Let's try and find a way out, try and solve it before it gets to this level. He said that thing, pointing to the phone, I don't touch it. And I think his fear of the phone was much more than somebody listening to him, because sometimes they feel they can pinpoint your location, and phones have been used to blow off other people. So he doesn't touch it. Some of them would ooze with an easy charm, and my friend, they don't understand me, we are not like this and all that. But you see through them. They know they are lying, but they do it anyway because they can't help it. They can't do anything else.
It's a great question. I know that we've got the microphone going to the front table and then to Clara at 2 tables back.
Thank you. I'm also coming back to Nelson Mandela. from the end of the Second World War until early 80s, we were in that dark period of what you call the Cold War. And during that time that Nelson Mandela and Bram Fischer and others were incarcerated in South Africa, as you know, we in the West were as much responsible for keeping them in jail as the South African government was, because the African National Congress and SACTU were both claimed to be communist organizations, and we were on an anti-communist kick. However, in the recent days, and I belong to an anti-apartheid movement, by the way, which is just something I want to dig in here. But in recent days, we have noticed that in South Africa, there has been killings again. There's been the same things happening until one of the leaders of that group of workers came out and said nothing has changed.
Yeah.
He said apartheid is still here. Do you have a comment on that?
Yes, I think it was very tragic, this recent incident with the strike in the mines which killed 44 people. And the incident reminded all of us of the apartheid era. You cannot have a situation where the police go in ostensibly to take police action and walk away with 44 people dead. This is war. This is not police action. You don't behave that way. The government is setting up an investigation, but I hope it will be thorough, and whoever were responsible are held to account. It is a source of distress for me personally that South Africa, which has so much hope, which has such potential, is going through this sort of crisis of leadership. And I think the saving grace is that they also have very strong civil societies building up, which I hope will put pressure on the government and keep its feet to the fire. I cannot, and I don't think anyone can condone what happened in the mines in South Africa. What is important is to hold those responsible accountable and not create the impression that impunity is going to be allowed to stand.
After Clara, we've got a question over there, and then Lillian.
How many more do we have?
Read this.
Mr. Annan, I would like to thank you for this evening and the opportunity to ask you a question. My name is Clara van Garnewijk, and I work as a pediatrician here in Vancouver, but have spent time on the African continent. And one passage which gripped me in your book, which I have to admit I haven't fully finished yet, but it's just appeared, so I have time. But the passage that gripped me was the part you wrote about malaria possibly being one of the biggest challenges, maybe even more than HIV and AIDS, to the African continent. And along with that, and then I will end with a question, is what you said this evening, that intervention in Syria does not necessarily or should not be military. When I was working on the African continent as a pediatrician, the one thing that I saw everyone doing and myself doing was always to prescribe anti-malarials, whatever the child presented with. Clearly, that's not the intervention that is needed there. And so my question to you is, what do you think, what is the way to go to fight malaria, the biggest challenge of the African continent, to let maybe Africa show what I think it has in store for us in the positive sense of the word?
Yeah, no, I think lots of work is being done on malaria, both from the Global Fund and other initiatives that the Secretary General has introduced, which is led by a gentleman called Ray Chambers. And they have been pushing this question of bed nets, where lots of families are now using the mosquito nets to protect themselves and their children. And in fact, when you look at the figures, malaria is down by about 40% over the last few years. And I hope this tendency or this acceptance of the nets will continue. I know there are also efforts being made to find a vaccine I don't know if that is going to work, but from what I read, some progress has been made. The third issue is also a question of making sure that the environment in terms of sanitation is clean and you don't have pots of water and breeding grounds for the mosquitoes. Not that you will get rid, have competition.
This is what it sounded like when Dick Cheney was here a year ago.
Thank you for sparing me that.
Thank you for sparing us.
Anyway, I think we can continue. And so I hope the malaria vaccine would, in the end, turn out. But I think the population are much more conscious. They take precautionary measures and also use their medication quite effectively. And I would hope that we will make progress. Some question of eradication has come, but it's such a huge continent. If you're on an island, you can do it. But if you have about 6 other neighboring countries and you do it and they don't do it, it doesn't. Everybody has to do it at the same time, and it's extremely difficult to coordinate. Some countries, 3 or 4 countries, are trying, but it's a tough issue for them.
Got last 2 quick questions over here. I think Lillian, did you have your hand up? No? Okay, I will ask the last question then, which came to us. Oh, I apologize. There we go.
Oh, Your Excellency, good evening. I would like to ask you a question about Rwanda, 1994, and the genocide.
Yes.
This was an example, unfortunately, of the UN's non-intervention rather than intervention. So if I recall correctly, I think you were head of the peacekeeping department.
You are correct.
At that period, thank you. So I guess you were in the thick of it when decisions were being made about whether to intervene or not. My question basically is, what exactly was the broader context, the factors and the arguments which led the Security Council to take what turned out to be tragic decisions, namely, firstly, not to intervene at all, and secondly, really and quite absurdly now looking at it, to withdraw to a bare minimum the existing peacekeeping force that was already in the country in Rwanda. That seems, in retrospect, totally bizarre. But I would love to have your comments on that particular scenario.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
No, it's a very important question. And as you rightly point out, I was the head of the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. I think to put things in context, let's start with Somalia. When the famine in Somalia got really bad, President Herbert Walker, President Bush Sr., at the invitation of the United Nations, put together a coalition of the willing to go to Somalia to help feed the people. It wasn't that food wasn't there. The food had gone in, but in some cases they were in the warehouses blocked by extremists, or sometimes they took the food. Thousands of US soldiers went in and deblocked that, and food began to get to the people. Then at a later stage, there was a warlord, General Adid, who was very problematic. And the US decided to send in special forces to deal with him. The arrangement to send in the special forces had apparently been arranged with my Secretary General, Secretary General Boutros, and General Howe, who was a US general leading the operation. But we in the peacekeeping department didn't know. Neither did the other UN peacekeepers know. The first thing I heard of it is when the accident happened, and I was told bodies of US troops were being dragged through the streets. The administration shamefully blamed the UN for messing up the peacekeeping operation and withdrew. It withdrew all the US troops. When the US withdrew, the other countries, particularly the Western countries, which had troops there, well-equipped and well-trained troops, all of them left. And this is leading us into 94. It was leading us into 94. About the time Rwanda was brewing, and a peace agreement was signed between the rebels and the government in Rwanda. And we were asked to send in peacekeepers to monitor the peace agreement that they have signed. And the force, as it were, was not very big. They took the smallest number, about 550 or 700 troops, with General Dallaire of Canada leading the force. The general was approached by someone saying he knows where weapons have been hidden, about 135 weapons, and he could take him there to seize it. It was the same episode, attempt, that led to the shooting down of the Black Hawk and the killing of the American soldiers, which led to withdrawal. So there was no appetite for risk within the Council. The US, in fact, came up with a document called PDD 25, saying they would not put peacekeepers under the UN command, still blaming us for what happened in Somalia. And the other countries who had also withdrawn their troops were not ready to go in. I myself spoke to lots of governments, and nobody will give us the troops. And sure enough, what we were afraid of also happened. Not long after that, 10 Belgian soldiers were killed, and Belgium withdrew its contingent, its battalion. When that happened, the Sri Lankan troops who were there were instructed only to protect themselves. And no government wanted to go in with additional troops, and decided the troops should be withdrawn, because in fact the number of troops who were left could not effectively do their work. What should have happened was it should have been strengthened. I mean, today I marvel when some governments said they didn't know what was happening in Rwanda. They had better information than we had. And in fact, when Dallaire came, we instructed him to share the information on the ground with the US ambassador, the French ambassador, and the Belgian ambassador. They were the three most influential ambassadors on the ground, and warned the president if anything happened, he would be held responsible. And the Secretary General's representative went and delivered the same message. But in hindsight, there was little that Dallaire could have done when we realized that it was a national. I think even when Dallaire sent his cable, one thought it was something that was going to be limited to the capital or but as it turned out, it was a national campaign and systematic killing of the Tutsis. And it was really a disgraceful period for all of us. The governments who said they didn't know, when they got to know, what did they do? They sent in planes to pick up their nationals, and the killings continued. And it's something that haunted quite a few of us and still haunts us. And it was also one of the reasons I pushed so hard to try and get the responsibility to protect established, so that we cannot say it's internal affair, it has nothing to do with us.
I think that's a great way to end off. Please join me in thanking Mr. Annan for his time with us.